Welcome, everyone, to this installation of our virtual diplomatic encounter series, UAE on the International Stage, the Historic Abraham Accords and the Future of the Middle East. Here's CEO Dan Mariaschin.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the latest virtual installment of the B'nai B'rith Diplomatic Encounter Series. I'm Dan Mariaschin, CEO of B'nai B'rith International. We're very fortunate to be joined today by His Excellency Yousef Al Otaiba, Ambassador of the United Arab Emirates to the United States. It wasn't so long ago when the mere idea of Israel breaking bread with an Arab nation felt like fiction. But we're living in an exciting time as the transformation of the Middle East is well underway. And this August, it was announced that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Emirati Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed would agree to fully normalize relations. The countries have committed to the exchange of embassies and ambassadors and to begin cooperation in a broad range of fields, including education, healthcare, trade, and security. The Abraham Accords is the most significant step towards peace in the Middle East in over 25 years, and only the third such peace in the last 72 with Israel. It will now join the agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan as a stabilizing force in the region. The growing realignment of interests in the Middle East sends a strong message to those who seek to promote chaos and instability in the region that their efforts will not succeed. In 2018, I traveled to the United Arab Emirates as part of a Conference of Presidents delegation, where I and other leaders of major American Jewish organizations were hosted by many of the ambassador's colleagues in Abu Dhabi, to be followed 2 short years later by the normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel is a profound shift in our conventional thinking about the region. B'nai B'rith International President Chuck Kaufman and I were honored to be at the White House South Lawn for the historic signing of the Abraham Accords on September 15th, marking this new era of diplomacy. Indeed, having engaged with states in the Arabian Gulf and throughout the Arab world for decades, we are encouraged to see how the Abraham Accords have opened the door to further agreements between Israel and her Arab neighbors. Israel and Bahrain have also opened up new ties, and most recently, Israel and Sudan. We look forward to seeing the dividends of peace for years to come. I'm pleased to now introduce His Excellency Yousef Al Otaiba, Ambassador of the United Arab Emirates to the United States, who took up his post in July of 2008. In his current role, Ambassador Al Otaiba has focused on enhancing UAE-US relations and improving bilateral security, economic cooperation, and trade. Previously, Ambassador Al Otaiba served for 8 years as the Director of International Affairs for the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and Deputy Supreme Commander of the UAE Armed Forces, His Highness General Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. We are fortunate to host him here today. Mr. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be with you.
Well, 3 months on, let's begin with that. 3 months on, how do you see the Accords unfolding? I know I see stories every day about airline routes being opened, tourism, business conferences. How do you see it?
Dizzying. The number of requests, the number of MOUs, the number of partnerships, the excitement, the enthusiasm. A couple of days ago, I read an article that airlines are increasing their flights because of the demand. There's more people who want to travel back and forth, so the flights that are in place are not sufficient for demand. I just witnessed my second Orthodox Jewish wedding in Dubai in less than 3 weeks. You know, it's exciting. And that's just 3 months. That's just in the first 3 months. Wait till there's more flights. Wait till Corona's under control. Wait till people understand each other a little more. I think you have these 2 countries, economies, societies that sort of saw each other through sort of glass. They weren't able to really communicate, talk, or visit. And now it's open. So there's all this excitement and energy and people wanting to kind of learn about each other. And I'll finish my answer with this funny anecdotal story. About 2 years ago, I got invited by in JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. to attend their annual gala dinner here in Washington. I've never attended the dinner before. I had never been invited before. So I gladly accepted and I showed up. It was a big event, 400, 500 people, about half a dozen ambassadors, about 7 or 8 members of Congress, and Secretary Pompeo was there. And so, when you go to these big, large events, you talk to people. So of all the ambassadors that were there, the Israeli ambassador was obviously there. So we're sitting on a big table, 25 people, with 6 other ambassadors, 6 members of Congress. And by the time when I left the dinner, I'm getting in my car, I'm checking my emails, a story had broke while we're at dinner in real time that the UAE ambassador and the Israeli ambassador are at a dinner. Of course, the story didn't mention that there was 500 other people or other diplomats, but it was breaking news 2 years ago that me and Ron Dermer happened to be at the same dinner. Fast forward to 2 years later, on Monday, Ron and I were doing a joint interview on Morning Joe together, talking about the Abraham Accords, talking about the future of the Abraham Accords. And I say that story just to describe how far we've come in just 2 years. And so try to think about where it's going 2 years from now. Imagine if we were doing this seminar 2 years from now, what we would be talking about.
Well, I want to talk about warm peace and cold peace, just to follow up on what you've said. I follow, we all do, these stories every day. There's a new story, and I saw on Israeli TV actually the other day that there was a big business conference in Dubai, which was attended by many Israeli businessmen. When we talk about normalization, one thinks, well, there's a process that goes on, and it's going to take years until everything gets into place, because our experience heretofore with peace has been more on the cold side than on the warm side.
Yes.
Now, when I look at the public in the UAE and how so many from different sectors, whether it's the tourism sector or it's the business sector and trade investment, that this is only in 3 months. How do you explain the difference between a cold peace and the warm peace, if I can use that term, with regard to what we're seeing now?
So I think we're just using different metrics today. I still remember, for those who are watching, I'm proudly half Egyptian. I was born and raised in Egypt. My mother is Egyptian. I lived there for 18 years of my life, and my wife is Egyptian. I am sort of, my roots are very much in Egypt. And even though President Sadat made this historic and courageous visit to Jerusalem and spoke at the Knesset in 1978 and subsequently made peace with Israel, all of us who grew up in Egypt grew up thinking Israel's the enemy. And it's not, it's for no other reason other than people remember having wars with Israel. 1973, 1967, the Palestinian issue was front and center. And so everyone in Egypt, even those who went to an American school like me, grew up thinking Israel's the enemy. You're programmed that way. They have borders, they have wars. Jordan, similar situation, a lot of baggage, a lot of history. The UAE doesn't have that baggage. The UAE has never had a war. The UAE doesn't share a border. And yes, in the past, almost every Arab country looked at Israel through the Palestinian lens, and solely through the Palestinian lens. Today, times have changed. There's a lot of younger people who don't remember those wars, who are saying, hey, Israel is a pretty strong economy. Why can't I trade and invest and research with it? Hey, we don't have the same hostility towards Israel that other countries do. Why can't we have a tough conversation on the Palestinian issue and still be able to travel and visit? So I think the region's changing. I think people's mindsets and attitudes are changing. I think people have open minds, particularly young people. And I'll give you one piece of data that validated our decision, even though that poll was done after the Abraham Accords were signed. There was a poll conducted in the UAE with just young Emiratis, 18 to 24 years old, only Emiratis. They said, do you support or are you against the Abraham Accords? Dan, do you want to take a guess at what the number was?
I'll leave it to you.
89% of young Emiratis supported it.
Wow.
It shocked even me. Like I was surprised. I thought 60, maybe 70%, 89%. Then the more interesting question came after. It was only two question poll. They said, well, would you support other Arab countries normalizing with Israel? 91%.
Wow.
I say those numbers because it gives you a snapshot into people's thinking, at least in the UAE. I'm not saying those numbers are shared in the entire Arab world. I don't think they are. But I think we're changing how people think. And the reason you saw Bahrain and Sudan follow is because I think we went first and conducted an experiment. It looked like that experiment was successful. So you got countries saying, hey, this worked. Why don't we give this a try? And I think you'll see more. I honestly believe you'll see more countries taking this approach. Countries are now realizing that, hey, we can have a business relationship and a trade relationship and still disagree on some political issues. I mean, Scandinavian countries have relationships with Israel. They don't agree on everything. So why should it be different in the Arab world? And I think this is where we are in 2020 and probably going to continue to go in that direction in 2021, provided we make sure we demonstrate this is successful. I think it's on us. It's on the Emiratis and the Israelis and the Bahrainis to show that this is successful, that this is delivering benefits for our people. So I think the ball's in our court. We have to make sure this is a success.
Well, one good indicator, one good barometer is always is sports. It's always a great leveler. And this week we saw that Beitar Jerusalem has at least a 50% stake has been sold to Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Nahyan, with a big investment coming over the next 10 years to elevate the club to world-class status. And I think I think that is a good indicator, really, if that kind of investment can be made and that kind of cooperation is out there, then everything else certainly can follow. I'd like to move to the regional peace and security area, if I may. Further to the new accords, the UAE and Israel have committed to develop and launch a strategic agenda for the Middle East to advance the cause of peace and stability, prosperity in the relations between both countries and for the Middle East as a region, as well as enhanced security, cooperation against regional threats. Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed has expressed his concern about Iran and its proxies posing a clear and immediate threat to the region and to Sunni Islam in general. How might this strategic agenda for the Middle East unfold, and what do you expect vis-a-vis Iran?
So I've made this point several times, so I'm happy to repeat it. I think the Abraham Accords were not directed towards anyone or any country or any society. I think this came about because we saw the potential in having a mutually productive relationship with Israel. The annexation debate was going to, I think, put us in a place where it was going to be very tough with us to continue cooperating with Israel openly the way we have for the last couple of years. I'm sure you saw instances of Israeli athletes participating in sports tournaments. I'm sure you saw that there was a big Israeli delegation that came to Abu Dhabi for the Special Olympics World Games last year. I'm sure you saw that Israel had a very public or will have a very public pavilion at Expo 2020. All these things were things we were doing very deliberately. And I think annexation was going to set it back. And that's why I think the Abraham Accords came about the way they did and the time they did. It was not about Iran. It was not about Turkey. It was about, this is ultimately good for UAE national interests. So I say that because I think people often misunderstand the motivation behind them, and I want to be clear. But the strategic agenda is, how can we cooperate on COVID research together? How can we cooperate on AI and cyber and technology? One of the first MOUs I saw after the agreement was a very prominent Emirati investor investing in a very prominent Israeli company called, I think, Mobileye, which is an autonomous driving car, autonomous vehicle company. That's, to me, what the Abraham Accords are about, is unlocking potential, creating jobs, working together, creating opportunities, creating hope. And That's where we're going. We are, I think, our two countries and our two economies are betting on a future that we believe in, are betting on a future betting that the future is going to be better than the past and the present. So I think that's the gist of what the strategic agenda is. Focusing 5 years out, 10 years out, making co-investments together, creating research programs together. To me, that's the spirit of the Abraham Accords.
With Bahrain and Sudan following the UAE and normalizing relations with Israel, plenty of speculation out there on some of the potential countries that might follow. And I wouldn't ask you to speak for your neighbors, but I will ask you, what do you see ahead as the next building blocks in the normalization of relations in the region?
I think we have to make sure people see this as a success. I am sure virtually every country in the region is watching closely to see how this unfolds, right? But every country has to make their decision based on their own political calculation, based on their own public opinion, based on their own internal, factors. And that's why I can't speak to those countries and how they make those evaluations. What I can speak to is we did this in the UAE. We concluded that this is in our national interest. We did it in a way that was a win-win, sort of in the fourth quarter, and I think it turned out great. But I can't speak for the leaderships of other countries because their factors and their criteria might be different than ours.
Well, I'd like to ask you about what you see as the impact of the Abraham Accords on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I was present actually for the signing of the Oslo Accords on the same White House South Lawn back in 1993, and there were great hopes. This was a tremendous breakthrough at the time, of course. And since the Oslo Accords, however, there have been several major opportunities for the Palestinians to conclude an agreement with Israel at Camp David, the Annapolis, the Kerry Initiative, which is probably the most recent. Now that the Abraham Accords are in place, serving as really an excellent template, an excellent example of what can be done, how do you envision the Israeli-Palestinian issue as a result of all of this?
So let's take it one step back and then fast forward to where we are today. One step back, if the annexation took place as planned, you and I would be sitting here today talking about a one-state solution, because I think annexation would have really destroyed the chances of a two-state solution. So what I'm happy about is that the Abraham Accords preserved the idea or notion of a two-state solution for a finite period of time. So I think we put time on the clock. We created space for diplomacy. The two-state solution still exists. Having said that, the two-state solution exists if the two parties can come together and at least start having a conversation. We have been encouraging both sides to at least engage. And whether it's on the Trump plan or a future Biden plan or anyone's plan, engage. You are the ultimate deciders of how this ends up. It is not the United States, it is not the Arab League, and it's not the UN. We can push, encourage, help, advise. We can be the supporting cast. But the two countries in question are the ones who need to come to that decision and make those compromises needed to make peace. We can provide, again, time and space. We can provide encouragement and moral support, but we can't make this decision for them. But the two-state solution exists today, largely because of the Abraham Accords.
Well, it's a shame actually that particularly with the Trump plan, that 4 years really were lost. And there is the expression of the train is leaving the station, and the opportunities here, I think, over the last 4 years were lost to grasp that with the Trump plan. But we hope that the lesson from the Abraham Accords will be not only to the Palestinians but to others that peace and normalization really does make sense. I'd like to move into another area relating to interreligious dialogue and the question of anti-Semitism. Does the UAE have plans to use or adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, and as a component of that, to introduce Holocaust education, because one of the most important factors in understanding the Jewish people is to learn about that terrible period between 1933 and 1945. Are there any plans afoot for that as a result of the signing of the Accords?
So now you're getting me too far down in the weeds on things I don't know which technical term we're using, but I'll just respond with this. The first time my foreign minister met with the Israeli foreign minister, do you remember where they met? It was about a month and a half ago in Berlin at the Holocaust Memorial.
Right.
That doesn't reflect to me that we are in Holocaust denial mode. That means that we are embracing something that we're trying to send a message that we can work with each other. Even before the Abraham Accords, you saw that we welcomed the Pope in February 2019. And one of the outcomes of that visit, which wasn't planned, was that we decided that we're building an Abrahamic family house. The Abrahamic family house is a compound that houses a mosque, a church, and a synagogue on the same compound, side by side, where people can understand interfaith, tolerance, inclusion, acceptance. To me, that's the message I think we have to send. So I find it very difficult to see that we are doing things like an Abrahamic family house or meeting at the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and yet denying the Holocaust. Those two don't fit together.
Well, the UAE has certainly taken a number of constructive steps in recent years to foster tolerance between Islam and Judaism, and other religions, as you pointed out. And it's important to see that you'll be using education and modern tools of communication to promote mutual understanding between Muslims and Jews in a country where previously little was known perhaps about the Jewish people. What role does and can, do you think, interreligious dialogue play alongside diplomatic engagement in deepening mutual understanding and cooperation, not only between the two countries, but more broadly put, in the Middle East?
I think it's incredibly important, and it doesn't have to be linked to the policy equation. Meaning, we have always publicly, privately endorsed and supported and embraced interfaith talks, interreligious talks. The UAE proudly boasts 200 nationalities and every single religious background you can possibly imagine, with their own house of faith and places to practice. So we are by nature a very diverse country, and we are successful because we are a diverse country. So interfaith and tolerance has always been a value in the UAE since its inception. You can do that even if you don't have a relationship with Israel, right? We were building the Abrahamic house before the Abraham Accord. So it doesn't have to be linked. I think there's a tendency to link Judaism to Israel, but that doesn't have to be the case. People can practice a tolerant form of religion and acceptance of other religions, even if your government has chosen not to normalize with Israel. Those two are not mutually exclusive. I think for someone like me, who's a proud moderate Muslim, I think it's really important for us to continue to send those messages, regardless of what government policies look like.
Mizrahi Jews trace their recent roots to the Middle East. How might they be best positioned, do you think, to serve as a bridge between the wider Jewish and Muslim communities?
I'm not sure I'm qualified.
Well, we have now, for example, Jews from the Middle East. Let's talk, if we can move into the Jewish community in the UAE, which is growing.
Yes.
We know that groups like the American Sephardi Federation have taken a great interest in this relationship. The question of Jews from the region, or Middle Eastern Jews, or Sephardic Jews, perhaps playing a role as a bridge between the world Jewish community and the world Muslim community, is really something that we see as having some great potential. Maybe you could talk a little about the Jewish community in the UAE and how it already is showing signs of growth, and bringing in a new rabbi, Rabbi Abadi. How do you see that going forward?
So first, I don't think it should be exclusively to any particular sect of Judaism to act as bridges. I think it's important for us as Muslims to also act as bridges between Muslims and Jews. I think it's everyone who has this kind of worldview that we all live together peacefully and coexist together and respect each other's religious backgrounds. It's incumbent upon all of us. I don't think it should be tasked to this guy or to that group. But I think the Jewish community is growing in Dubai because they feel welcome, or they're growing in Abu Dhabi because they feel safe. I think the reason you had before Corona over 24 million tourists in the UAE, a small country that isn't even 50 years old, is because people feel safe, people feel welcome, and I think they feel welcome whether they are Jewish, Buddhists, Christians, or Muslims. And I think that's kind of the secret sauce of the UAE. That's why the Abraham Accords can happen. That's why we're building Abrahamic family houses. That's why the Pope's first visit to the Arabian Peninsula was to Abu Dhabi, where he held a mass for 180,000 people. So I think this is our DNA. This is who we are. That's why I think the Jewish community is growing there, because they feel safe and welcome.
Well, the UAE is the first country in the region in many centuries with a new and growing Jewish community, and it certainly has been noted that the representatives of the community have reached out to us, and we have reached out to them, and there's a certain excitement about the community, learning about it, learning about everything from the size of the community to the kosher restaurants and all the other things in between. I'd like to, if I can, just move to one other area, because you have represented your country here for a number of years. Just talk for a moment, if you would, about the bilateral relationship between the UAE and the United States.
It's great. I've been working on it for almost the entire 20 years I've been in government, including the last 12 that I've been here. I think our relationship with the United States has been really strong. If our relationship with the United States was a stock, it would be going like this, right? Doesn't mean we don't disagree. Of course we disagree. There's no country in the world where we agree on everything or disagree on everything. I think the UAE-US bilateral relationship, by any indicator you want to use, is really healthy and still thriving. If you look at economics, we've been the largest trade partner for the United States for the last 10 years in a row. If you look at security cooperation, look, it's just constantly improving over the last 15 years. If you look at cultural and social activities, we are now proudly home of one of the most advanced hospitals in the Middle East, Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi, one of the most progressive and open universities in the region, NYU Abu Dhabi. So there's so many partnerships and collaborations on the economic side, on the cultural side, on the security side, and now on the religious and interfaith side. So I think the relationship is a really, really healthy state. My job here is to continue to improve it. There is no finish line or target where you can say, okay, well, we've gotten to where we want to. This is a constantly evolving target. And I want to make sure that our two countries are aligned all the time.
Well, you have played really a central role in the Abraham Accords coming to fruition. Over the years, we know that this just didn't happen in a matter of weeks. It happened over a period of time, and you were very central to that process. Just in concluding here, how do you see your own role going forward? It's for us, it's really been it's essential. So we hope that you're not going to now just kind of stand by the side of the road. Where do you see yourself going forward? Because you have to nurture these things.
Yeah, so I feel like I have some serious, significant stake in ensuring that this is a big success. I really do. And so far, by the measure of the first 3 months, I think we're off to a wildly successful start. But I'll tell you a personal story that that keeps me excited and why I think I should continue to make sure this moves in the right direction. Like I told you, I grew up in Egypt, and I always grew up thinking that Israel is my adversary before I was even able to comprehend why. Every day as I drive from my house or take the school bus from my house to school, we would pass by the Israeli ambassador's residence, which was like halfway between our house and the school. And I would look at it and I was like, why is the Israeli ambassador here? And I really didn't understand why. Fast forward to where we are today. I have a 10-year-old son. Uh, Coincidentally, my son was born on September 15th, which was the day of the signing of the White House of the Abraham Accords. So for the last 3, 4 nights before the signing ceremony, I kept telling my son Omar, I said, you know how cool it is that your birthday is going to be on the same day as the signing of this historic peace agreement. And he's 10 years old, so he has no clue what I'm talking about. And I kept telling him this almost every day. And the night before, very excited, we're getting up and we're going to sign this historic thing, the White House lawn. I said, Omar, do you know how cool this is? Your birthday's on the same day. He looks at me, he goes, Daddy, I think you're more excited about the signing ceremony than about my birthday. I said, no, I'm not more excited. I'm just really excited that they're both on the same day. So the other bookend of this story is the way I grew up is going to be fundamentally different than the way he grows up. He's going to grow up thinking it's totally normal to do business with Israel. It's totally normal to visit. It's totally normal to go and do an investment deal or a trade deal. And I think that's where the region has changed from when I was growing up and how the region viewed Israel to the way it's going to view Israel for my 10-year-old son. I think that's the part I'm the most excited about.
Well, the Abraham Accords are not just a building block. Of course, they are a pillar in this process. And again, we know the personal role that you played in this, and we're all deeply grateful for that, because as a result of this, we're able to see now, across the horizon at prospects for other such agreements for reconciliation. In a time, this has been a pretty bleak year in any case because of COVID, but the Accords, the Abraham Accords, really stand out as such a bright light. And again, we're appreciative for the role that you played in it. Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today. We certainly understand your time has been in high demand of late over the last few months, and we truly are grateful for this opportunity to host you in conversation.
Thank you. It was great to be with you.
I'd also like to thank our mutual friend and colleague, Eli Epstein, for his good counsel and support in advance of today's discussion. Thank you all again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you soon at one of our upcoming virtual programs. For B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone.